everybody. Welcome back to Emma's Pearls. Today we have with us Buddy Younggreen, Gracia Jones, and then my dad, Michael Kennedy. So today we're going to talk about how they all got together and a little bit about the reunion and the very first reunion and how things have run with the Joseph Smith family. So, um, Buddy, since you were the one that kind of gathered everybody, do you want to kind of talk about how you met Gracia and Michael and brought the family together?
I was following diary notations and some papers I had regarding David Hiram Smith, the last born of Joseph and Emma's, the one that had difficulties with, we think, hypoglycemia now, but they didn't know what it was then. And I went to Elgin, Illinois during a spring trip in 1971, I believe. And coming back from Elgin, Illinois, I came through Iowa, where acquaintance that I'd met over the telephone, Bob Smith, an actor, told me if I was really interested in gathering genealogical material on the Smith family to look up his aunt, Lejeune Griffin, in Dow City, Iowa. His father and Lejeune were brother and sister. And it seems to me I met Lejeune's sister, Bee, who was also there. And I had a wonderful visit with Lejeune and Bee. And she said someone a little closer to me that I should look up would be Garcia Denning up in Montana. And I didn't know it was pronounced Gracia. Then evidently she didn't quite know either. But she gave me some biographies that she had typed from the journal History of the Reorganized Church Archives on Alexander Hale Smith. I think there were 3 volumes, and I got so involved reading those, it got me home in no time, and soon after that I called Gracia, introduced myself over the phone, and told her what I was about, trying to gather descendants of Joseph Smith's family for a reunion. I think maybe our last visit I covered this pretty well. If there's anything specifically you would like to know, I can do that. But this is how at least I was put in touch with Gracia. It was the second reunion in 1973 when I met your father's aunt, your great aunt, Glenna Henderson, in Independence, Missouri. And she said, well, if you're gathering information, she said, my great nephew out in Tonopah, Nevada, sounded like Batwing, Wyoming, way I've never heard of it, but she said, look up Mike Kennedy. He's going to school now in Cedar City. And that was the year I looked up Michael. So my next important objective was to see that Michael and Gracia got to meet one another. And Michael was in love. All he could really talk about in depth with Darcy. Didn't matter what time it was or what he'd had to eat, but it was Darcy on his mind. So I figured the only way I'd get them together is put Mike and Darcy in the back seat of my car and drive them up to Whitefish, Montana, where Gracia was. And that's, as far as I know, the first time you guys met, when I introduced you to each other up there.
There's a coincidence there, buddy, that you probably aren't aware of, that I became aware of. And I didn't know about this until uh, later, but after I was baptized in 1973, my father placed a phone call to his aunt, Glenna,
Oh,
and she did not mention that you were there, but you were there over listening over the conversation with my dad. So it was more than coincidence in my mind that you happened to be in Glenna's home at the same time my father called her to mention that I had just joined the church.
oh my goodness. Well, it certainly was in the right time period. And her little home was just south of the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. And I remember she told me she was Presbyterian by faith. And so it didn't bother her to meet a Brighamite from Utah or share histories. I found her charming. A few days later, I took her and Aunt, your mother's sister, Gracia,
Elizabeth.
Aunt Elizabeth, I took with Glenna to the Liberty Jail. And we traveled in a hailstorm to see it. But Glenna always wanted to see it. And so a hailstorm wasn't going to stop me. I put him in the car. I was working for Ellis Craig at that time in Hollywood, an advertising agent. And he went with, and he actually picked up Glenna and then picked up Aunt Elizabeth following that and put them both in my car because there was so much water coming down the coverts from the hailstorm. And I remember Aunt Elizabeth said, "Not many men have lifted me in my lifetime." So she was quite pleased. My boss was 6'4" and a pretty big guy. He could handle the assignment. So we went to the Liberty Jail that night, and she gave me your contact information. And next time I came through Cedar City, somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, I pounded on your door. You know the rest of the story. Anything? Oh, the sound is gone. I can't hear.
Oh, I was
Yeah.
muted. Dad, do you want to kind of speak to what happened at that point? And then I want you guys to kind of talk about how you all met up after that.
Well, the first time I met Buddy, from what I understood from you,
Talk louder,
after you left
please.
Glenna, you were in Salt Lake and you had a conversation with President Lee of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and happened to mention that you just heard that I was baptized. And he suggested that you pay me a visit and see if I would spend a little time with you and him in Salt Lake. So you came to my door in Cedar City, which was a student apartment complex. And the first time you knocked on the door, you disturbed everybody pretty well in my apartment because it was at 2 o'clock in the morning.
I've been told I'm disturbing.
And so I was dressed for the evening, and you were dressed in a suit. And you happened to mention that President Harold B. Lee wanted to visit with me. I'd been a member of the church for a little bit over 30 days. And then I wondered in my mind, what in the world did I do wrong to get the attention of the president of the church that sent this man here to want me to go up to Salt Lake to visit with him? And so you indicated that you had some other things you were going to do, and you're going to come back later in the morning and pick me up and take me to a drive to Salt Lake where you introduced me to President Harold B. Lee, and that was the first time I met you.
That was great. I can't remember what I did from then until morning, but I must have kept entertained. It probably had something to do with one of the local restaurants. I remember your attire was sleeping um, nightwear, and you had been asleep, so you woke up really quite alert. I was impressed.
So then, when did you guys all first kind of get together and talk? And Gracia, actually, maybe I'll ask this first. Gracia and Dad, when was the first time you guys talked and met each other?
Well, that's
Buddy brought
within a short period of time. I took Michael and Darcy up to Whitefish after talking to Gracia, and she said, I'm anxious to meet him, and I can have him meet a lot of the cousins that live up here. So Gracia talked to her cousins and her aunt and others, and she had an agenda for us. I remember her uncles Brainerd and Jim very well, and I remember Gracia's uncle Jim asked what my intent was getting to meet all the family, and I said I'm trying to bring about a family reunion of the Joseph Smith descendants. And Gracia's uncle Jim caustically said, there isn't a place big enough. That stands out in my mind. And through the
he isn't
years, of
thinking
course,
them
I
numbers.
understood what he means because of the theological differences. But at that time, I wasn't aware of them. I'm a was fairly new convert, just 10 years when I got interested in the Smith family. So there were a lot of things I didn't know. I had no idea that suggesting they get together might be like bringing the Jews and the Arabs to a confined area. Had no idea. I might
I,
have hesitated if I knew that.
I remember
But
standing on the doorstep of Gracia's home when you took me up to her home. You introduced me as the Melchizedek priesthood holder that she's been praying for. And Gracia, your response was I was expecting a high priest,
Right. I wanted somebody to take it off my shoulders.
not just a little kid.
Yeah. You
I
and Darcy
vividly
were very,
remember
very
the
cute.
back seat was properly initiated when Darcy and Michael had a bit of a coke fight while we were eating fast food on the way to Montana. They only had eyes for each other, but they didn't care where we were going or what we were doing. But as we progressed, meeting the family and all, I think Michael was quite impressed with cousins he hadn't met. And with Gracia, they had no trouble talking, visiting, and talking about anything. I never have any trouble, but after a while, people stop listening. So,
At that point, I knew very little
So,
about
Gracia, what was your
any of the
impression
history, too, as
of
far as the
Dad and of
family
Buddy?
connections went. I knew a few relatives who had come to visit from Iowa and Missouri, but as far as any acquaintance with the things we've learned since, which we all had to learn pretty much at the same time, was how diverse the attitudes were, and some of the subjects were extremely sensitive to some. We weren't sensitive to anything because we didn't know.
So it kind of helped that you guys were raised outside of any kind
Mm-hmm.
of
Just
affiliation.
um, made friends as face value right there, and they were fun. It was fun to meet Mike and Darcy.
So then how did the dynamic work after that? How did you guys go about gathering the family and doing that reunion?
Well, we didn't gather families at first. we got acquainted with, I got acquainted, Buddy and I went to Buddy's. Didn't I go to Provo and see you, Buddy, in, was it June, April? What was it? Of 1972, when we were talking about what to do and how to do it. And Buddy took me to meet President Lee. We went to your shows up in on the mountain, wasn't it?
Jackson Hole.
It seems like I remember going to a Joseph F. Smith reunion in February of 1972. And I met 5 or 6 living grandchildren of Hiram. And I realized that in Independence there was Wallace and Reginald Smith that were grandsons of Joseph. And I had met several family members from the Samuel Harrison Smith family, Joseph and Hiram's younger brother. And all of these groups had family associations loosely put together where they'd meet in connection with conference. And it seemed like that was the best place for me to begin, to go to the existing little family groups that were meeting and get the word out and see how the ground laid for a big reunion that summer of 72 in Nauvoo. And that's the procedure. I think it was March that I went back to Independence, the latter part of March, to get endorsement from President Wallace Smith of the Reorganized Church. And he was very gracious and kind to give it. I became aware that there were some problems in the Smith family because there were 2 Samuel Smith organizations, and they had a little friction with each other, but they both met all the time and they knew each other. And you know, you start mending fences at home first, and then you get the bigger group together. And I was getting excited about it. I was saddened because I wanted Gracia to attend this reunion, and she was expecting David. David came along at just the right time to be included, but he wasn't really there yet, you know. And
I was
Gracia said
I was
she
almost
brings
ready to deliver
people.
by the time we had the first reunion.
Yeah.
But later, the Spirit had worked on her, and she called and she was ready. She said, I remember with my other children, I never had a labor that was less than 72 hours. So even if I go in labor on the bus, we'll have time to get somewhere if this child is born, going or coming to Nauvoo. And that's what happened. We had a couple busfuls of people that kept wanting to feed Gracia crackers for her nausea, but I don't know that helped a lot, did it, Gracia? I think
I had
labor
several.
started.
I had several of
Diane,
those. Yeah, buddy. I had several of those wonderful elderly cousins offer to
labor
take care of
started in
things. They
Cheyenne,
delivered lots of babies.
but we made it all the way to Salt Lake. And then President Lee's son-in-law was president, CEO of the LDS hospital. So it worked out just great. We took Gracia from the bus station over to the hospital, and we had 3 or 4 90-year-olds come and visit you there, Gracia. They all had ideas for names. And, it was fun. The grandchildren of the martyrs, and of course that's Joseph and Hiram, but I include Samuel too,
Yes.
because he died from the effects of the same mob that was responsible for the deaths of his brothers
Yeah.
for killing him, I think. And so here, grandchildren were still living, and they never had met one another. And their common progenitors sealed their testimony with their blood in Carthage. And there just was no question this had to be done. They had to get together. And it was a wonderful experience. Joseph Fielding Patrick, on the Joseph F. Smith side, Hiram's youngest son, did a lot to organize bus tours, 2 different bus tours at the same time, because we had so many going back that first year. I think he did the same thing the second year. Weren't there 2 buses, Gracia?
Yes.
I remember Aunt Edith, his mother, was Joseph Fielding Smith's sister and daughter of Joseph F. Smith. And she went on the bus with us. The only place she didn't want to go when we were back in Nauvoo is she didn't want to go into the Carthage jail. That had given bad feelings to her father, and she didn't want to go through that. But she joined us for everything else. And she was quite a lady to reckon with. In my mind, she was 5'10", but I think really in real life, she was about 5'2". Somehow she could always look down at you, even if she was much shorter. I remember she came up to me on the bus when we were going back to this second reunion in Independence, Missouri, and she said, "Tell me about yourself." Well, I said, "I'm a convert to the church," and I said, "I used to be pretty narrow-minded. I didn't want to hear about any other religion. I was kind of uninterested." She said, "You know, I used to be uninterested. I used to be stubborn about things. My goodness, if I had met her before, I might not have existed the meeting." But she always came through, one way or the other, didn't she, Gracia?
Oh, she was wonderful to me. She really
had
was.
gathered so much genealogy material. She, ironically, Aunt Edith, Joseph Fielding Patrick's mother, was a cousin of Reginald Smith's wife. They were both Luffs. Did you remember that, Gracia?
Yes.
As well as being related on the Smith side, they were related on the Luff side. Part of the Luff family stayed in Independence and part came to Salt Lake City. So there were double relations there.
So what kind of seemed like the biggest contributor to the families not getting along? So you had the 2 Samuel parties, or 2 gatherings. What kept them apart?
Well, traditionally, the only difference in the early churches, our church and the reorganized church, was the belief in plural marriage being taught by Joseph Smith. It was rather a moot point by 1972 and 73 because you couldn't be a member of our church anywhere in the world and subscribe to plural marriage. It was just out of the question. But the reorganized church had converted a couple big colonies in India, and after they were all baptized, they discovered they were polygamous. So they had a revelation saying if it wasn't against the law of the land and they weren't accumulating other wives after coming into church membership, it was possible to be a member of the reorganized church and subscribe to plural marriage. but nowhere was it possible, if they knew about it, if you were subscribing to plural marriage or someone you did know out in the West, you couldn't be a member of the church in good standing. So the
In
two
Utah.
positions had reversed themselves in 100 years. And gradually, the other differences all faded away. The biggest difference that came about was a geographical one. When the members of the church left Nauvoo, in those first exoduses, nearly 10,000 people left. And the entire population of the city of Nauvoo in 1845, 1846 was 11,000. So that didn't leave very many people. Geographically, they didn't all live right in the city. They lived in the farming areas adjacent to the city. But they didn't know doctrine was pouring forth so quickly, with Joseph and Hiram realizing time was running out, that the people in the city were hearing things that the people in the rural areas weren't hearing. And I remember our English professor mentor, Clinton F. Larson, my creative writing teacher, who also went with us and was very inspirational in helping me focus on getting a family reunion to do something for the prophet Joseph's family, said the time is coming. There isn't any differences anymore. And when the family realizes that after geography split them and theological differences, you'll see a day when they come back together again. And I found that that's true. I think it started, hasn't it, Gracia, Michael?
As a family, we've come back together. I really don't think
At
there's any group anywhere that don't appreciate
that
this
second
connection.
reunion,
Yeah.
I invited the historian of our church, Leonard Arrington, to talk about Joseph F. Smith, our sixth president, I think, fifth or sixth. And I invited one of the reorganized church historians.
Alma Blair.
Who was it, Gracia?
Alma Blair. Alma Blair.
Yes, yes. And he spoke about Joseph Smith III. And Alma Blair, our historian friend, brought one of his former neighbors from Lamona, Iowa, to the Independence reunion. I'd made friends with her. Emma Rebecca Weld Nolan. And he said, well, go see if you can get her to cooperate and come to the reunion, but don't tell her you're a Utah Mormon or she'll slam the door on you. Well, when I got to her house, I realized you don't try to fool little old ladies. They know. They somehow know everything. And I said, Sister Nolan, I'm here from Utah doing research on the prophet Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith's families. And I understand you're a great granddaughter of Joseph. She said, you're from Utah? I said, yes, ma'am. She said, you're a Brighamite? I said, I guess so. I'd read that term, but I never heard anyone use it. She said, I'm a Josephite. Why would a Brighamite want to come and talk to a Josephite? While I was trying to think of an answer, she said, well, don't stand out on the porch, come in. And so we had a wonderful visit. And I stayed a couple of hours. She had a painting on the wall of her home that is a mirror image backward painting of the oil painting we just acquired of Joseph. along with Emma's, from the reorganized church. Supposedly the front on view painted from life. But this was a backward version, and there's theories that maybe one or both paintings were painted from a daguerreotype, which were backward photographs. And I so wanted a picture of that painting at Emma's home in Lamona, Iowa, but I didn't want to offend her. So it came to me. I said, Emma, will you stand over by this painting? I'd like to take your picture there and have it as a souvenir of this visit.
Do you still have that picture?
Yes, I do.
Oh,
She said, what are you going to do with that picture? Put it in a polygamy magazine? And when I assured her I wasn't going to put it in a polygamy magazine and she wouldn't be offered on the blocks for sale, she posed. When I left a couple hours later, she said to me, you know, I'm an old lady. Nobody ever comes to see me. You don't seem like a stranger. If you're ever back this way again, will you stop and see me? And I gave her a kiss on the forehead and a big hug. And I said, I most certainly will. Well, this Alma Blair, the next year, took her to the reunion in Independence. She didn't care where it was or exactly what it was, just so she was included. She was happy to go. And after the two historians for the different churches presented their papers, Leonard Arrington had to be taken to the Kansas City airport to go home. And so Alma Blair asked Emma Rebecca if she'd like to ride with. She was 90 something at that time. Sure. She was all game. And when they got to the airport and Leonard waved and got out and went in, she said, Elma, who was that man? And he said, well, Emma, that was Leonard Arrington. He's the historian of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City. You mean he's a Mormon? Well, yes. What's he doing at our reunion? Well, Elma said, Emma, half of the people there are from Utah at the reunion. You know that young man you're always visiting with and are so fond of, Buddy Younggreen? He's a Utah Mormon. She said, oh no, he seemed like such a nice young man. We had two reunions then, and what a joy it was to report about them to President Lee. That's the second one is when I met Michael's great aunt, and she was a hoot. She was a kick. I really liked her, and I never met a Smith I didn't love. A couple of them were hard to like, but I loved them all, and I think they knew that I cared about them. When I came into the church in the late 50s, it's 1958, I was so converted I wanted everybody to understand Mormonism the way I did, and it wasn't taken so well by my friends who were in other religions and other walks of life. And I decided something that was pretty critical that helped me with my career and my social life. If people don't like you, it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. It only matters if they like you. So I tried to get in the business of making friends. And I think I did that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Whenever I would go see the reorganized patriarch and his wife, Lorraine, I would take them something, genealogy or a short story about their family. He was a great-grandson of David Hiram Smith. And I just give them photographs and news stories and diary prints. that I had made up. I asked his wife, Lorene, once if she'd pick up one of the Independence newspapers prior to the reunion. I couldn't get one to get a news story about the gathering in Independence. So when I got there, she presented me with the newspaper, and I felt like I was in a Charlie Brown cartoon. She said, "That'll be 10 cents, please." 10 cents? I gladly paid it.
Awesome. So then, what reunion were you all part of?
Well, these first two
I believe
reunions, I was a student at Rexburg, so I didn't participate in them. I had student life and a student income, and I wasn't able to do it, so I didn't join all the reunions until much later. My next big episode uh, with all with both Buddy and Gracia is when I organized I was giving a lot of firesides. Gracia was giving a lot of firesides. Buddy was giving a lot of firesides. The patriarch to the church, Elder G. Smith, was doing his own firesides, and I came up with the idea to do one fireside, which was generated by a radio broadcaster, Bishop. He was a bishop of his ward, so he was known as Bishop. And we did a series of firesides where Buddy spoke, and then Eldred spoke, and then Gracia spoke, and then I spoke 1 week after another, successive firesides, which was recorded by the radio station and broadcast. And that was a lot of fun, and it got a lot of attention and a lot of reviews.
Wow. So you organized that, or you guys all organized that, and where was that? And
Well,
we had
the broadcast was in Provo, and the my ward building in Provo by Lakeview area, which is on the southwest side. The bishop would bring down his radio equipment, and each Sunday we met in that ward and broadcast from there. And later on, a tape was given to us of those broadcasts and those firesides.
I think, was that Ray Bishop, Michael?
Yes, it was Ray Bishop.
Ray Bishop is the brother-in-law of one of my best friends and actors, Scott Fulmer. And Scott Fulmer's great-great-grandfather was John Fulmer, that was one of Joseph's bodyguards that stayed in the Carthage jail. I had the Smith family and everybody else's group charts memorized, and I knew who was who before I ever started on my own. And it was fun to see how everybody fit together. That was great.
All these many years later, where I still do firesides, I have individuals in the audience who come up and remember that radio broadcast and the talks that each of us gave during that series.
wow, do you guys still have a recording of that?
I have it somewhere.
Somewhere.
Yeah,
I think that's from West Side Story, the song.
yeah.
So,
I do have a copy of the
that's
Makita
cool.
interview.
Is that the broadcast, or what is that?
No, this is a 2005 interview that was with our best friend here, Buddy Younggreen, and Carol Makita on KSL. And it's absolutely fabulous. I listened to it yesterday, and I thought, there is no better account anywhere than this of that event. 2005 was the 200th birthday year of the prophet, and she interviewed Buddy about the very same things we're talking here. How did it all start, and what did you do?
Oh, wow.
It was
We'll have to get
beautiful.
Well,
that.
these are little glimpses that I'm sharing with you, and Gracia and Michael remember most of them more than I do, I'm sure. But everything possible to get the family doing things. So in subsequent reunions, Smith family members out here were hosting family from the Midwest and other parts of the nation to stay with them and participate in the reunions. The first reunion we had in Utah was 1975 at the new high-rise church office building. It was just opened, and the first presidency turned over the theater and the restaurant on the roof to us. We had the Smith family with a vista view of the whole valley, and I brought my actors down from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, because all the general authorities were in Munich at a area conference of the church. And I can remember our dear friend Michael Watson, the secretary to the first presidency, saying, well, maybe it's better the brethren are in Germany and they're not seeing your showgirls Charleston up in the first presidency reception area. And one of my leading ladies at another time wore one of her gorgeous opera gowns. This is Margot Watson, to come and sing up at the top of the high rise for the Smith family. And Michael was sitting with Elder Ballard at the dinner table, and Elder Ballard started to say something and didn't. And Michael said, well, buddy, the folks may forget what song Margot sang here, but they'll never forget that red gown she wore. And it was indicative of an opera diva, so you can imagine how fancy it was and gorgeous. But it was fun, bringing the actors to entertain and help with registration, in addition to Smith family that were there to help, but their positions were better served meeting and mingling with the Smith family as they came into these reunions. But the Salt Lake City gathering was a wonderful success. And by that time, President Kimball was president of the church. He didn't have quite the same drive to get the family together that President Lee did, but he was wonderful about helping us with absolutely everything we needed. Would you like to hear a wonderful story about him?
Yes.
I had the program printed up of the talks we were having done at this Salt Lake reunion, and I went in to see President Kimball, and I presented him. He got up and came over and gave me a kiss. He was one of the sweetest people I've ever met in my whole life. I didn't expect to get quite the kiss I did, because he grabbed my jowls and pulled me right down, kissed me on the mouth. He said, that's what I think of the prophet Joseph.
Oh.
And I said, well, President, I've brought you this program with pictures of the Smith family. And he looked at it and said, well, there's my Aunt Alice. I said, your Aunt Alice? Yes, he said, she was a twin sister of my father, Andrew. And I went to all the Smith reunions as a young man because my aunt married Joseph F. Smith. So I was raised at Smith family reunions. He said, as a matter of fact, I was sent on a mission in 1914 to Independence, Missouri.
Oh, wow.
Are you aware of that chapel? I said, oh, yes, President. I've been there many times. He said, I helped build it.
Oh, wow.
He said, at that time, Joseph III was still living. And after I'd be on my mission during the day, I'd come over in the evening and visit with him. I'd sit with him on the front porch. You knew Joseph Smith III? He said, oh, yes. I talked to him every night after my mission rounds. And I said, well, was he cordial? That was the only word I could think of. He said, oh, yes, very cordial, but he didn't do anything to help me. I said, just out of curiosity, President Kimball, who set you apart for your mission to Independence, Missouri? He said, my uncle, J. Golden Kimball. I'll bet that was a colorful setting apart.
Wow.
It gave him certainly stamina and courage and patience to go through so many things he did as a young man. But he, like President Lee, wanted to meet all the Smith family as they would come into the church. It was always fun for me to take them, whether they came into the church or not, to meet the presidents. I took them in to meet President Lee and President Kimball and Ezra Taft Benson and Howard Hunter and Gordon Hinckley, Thomas Monson, many. And it was always a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. I kept the line going, didn't I, Michael?
Yeah, very much so.
He learned the way himself. He went several times after that and had wonderful experiences.
That
with the
reunion in the top of the church office building in '75 was my first one that I was with you.
I remember that
And that was
too.
because it was local.
For some it
Kimball,
was.
President Kimball called me by my first name, and we were good
I was
friends.
I was trying to get the reorganized church patriarch to come to my summer ward in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. But his only visit to that area was an official one as a patriarch of the reorganized church. So I invited him to put on a fireside at the Pink Garter Theater in Jackson, Wyoming. We had to perform by the terms of our lease 7 days a week. And they were all LDS kids that were in my plays up there, and they worked in town to earn money to go back to school in the fall. And the reorganized church patriarch and his wife did a fireside at the Pink Garter Theater at 9 o'clock at night after Belle Starr was my summer musical. And the reorganized church patriarch's wife said, the experience at the Pink Garter Theater was the most fun we had on this whole trip, but it'll never appear in our official report back to Independence.
Wow.
When I went
We
to that
even
first
installed
reunion,
a pink garter on her knee while she came to the play.
I was only a member of the church 2 years on that first reunion, married only 1 year, and everything was still new to me.
Yeah, it's still new to me. Patriarch Smith was explaining his genealogy to a dentist friend of mine. And Eldred had a kind of a unique genealogy. He was directly related to Joseph Sr. on his father's side, but Joseph Smith's younger brother, Uncle John, was a progenitor of his mother. And so on the wall, in addition to the family tree, Eldred had paintings of the individuals coming down to him. And my dentist friend was so taken with that genealogy. In front of Eldred, he walked over to the wall and he said, well, in other words, Patriarch, You're related to both your father and your mother. We just fell on the floor laughing. Well, he said, That's not what I meant. But I said, That's what you said. Greg Ullman was a great friend of the family, and he became the dentist for Brother Haycock and Michael Watson. So some good things of a civil nature came around for people that participated on the reunion too.
So then I'm curious, at what point, Dad, did you end up taking over and um, gathering the family, but also, I don't know, President Hinckley talking to you about um, not just it becoming your problem, and then using Buddy and Gracia to do what you were asked to do?
Well, actually, it was President Lee who gave me the go ahead and the urging to do it. To take over, he said, You're just the perfect person to do that. You're a buddy to the family. You're not a church officer. You're not a Smith family member. So if you make a mistake up there at the top, it doesn't reflect on anybody but yourself. He said, The best thing about you is you're a nobody. I wasn't quite sure how I felt about that, but I knew what he meant.
Yeah.
And when President Benson became president of the church, he had a brass sign on his desk that he gave to Michael. I always wanted that. I coveted it a great deal, but I didn't get it. But you'd be interested in it. President Benson's little motto during some of his life, it said, God so loved the world, he didn't send a committee. I loved it. I have a hard time. I'm a director. There are other talented people in this world, other leaders. There are everything you can think of. But when you're directing, you can only have one director. And so I would take over the duties of executive secretary or president. I did that for 33 years.
No.
And then I felt it was time someone else had those blessings. And I stepped aside for Francis and Steve Orton, who now preside over the Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack family organization. They're doing a wonderful job. Very conscientious, good people. And Francis is the daughter of Joseph Fielding Patrick, who helped me with the first reunion. So it passes down the way it should, through family and the people loving the work. I
Yeah.
couldn't say enough good about these folks.
And you were
I would
still
like
doing
to
the,
I would like to clarify something, Angeline, for you, because you just asked, when did Michael take over? Well, Michael never took over family reunions. Michael took over the gathering of the documenting on the computer of all the
Oh, yeah,
database for the
everybody had
family,
different jobs.
and
The
and
business.
that was what
oh,
he has soared in.
Michael came
A
in as a
marvelous work.
genealogist and a computer whiz, and he organized everything. Gracia mended fences. If this side of the family or that side broke into tears about something, Gracia could break into tears too and comfort them. And she was great being a peacemaker.
mm-hmm.
And my responsibilities were things I'd learned from producing and directing plays through the years, the entertainment and the organization of some of the physical facilities. But it was a joy, never felt like a job. I
Yeah.
enjoyed every minute of it.
Though I think also in the 80s, President Hinckley put Michael in charge of the junior family. I think that's where I also mixed it up
No,
a
no,
little.
no, no, no.
No?
President
You had
Hinckley
that idea, didn't
gave
you, Michael?
Michael
Well,
understanding of organizing the junior family in an official organization, which we had always just been an appendage with the senior. But now, in and that happened actually spiritually to you, Michael, didn't it? In
well,
1984, when we were in Kirtland on that trip,
yeah,
and you had that spiritual experience
I had
telling
a
you what you
spiritual
needed to do.
experience, and then after the spiritual experience, you and I and your mother went to the Johnson farm in Kirtland to have luncheon with President Hinckley. But prior to that, at the end, President Hinckley was there in Kirtland with President Benson and area authorities to dedicate the Newell K. Whitney store. At
Yeah,
the end of that
and we were all there
dedication,
together.
we went to the Steak Center for a breakfast, and I was invited up to give the opening prayer for breakfast and the blessing on the food. At the conclusion of that, President Hinckley pulled me aside and said he wanted a few moments with me. And in it, he mentioned some of the issues that the church was facing, the polygamy issue, the who really were not the descendants of the prophet Joseph Smith, and why Emma didn't come west. And President Hinckley at the time was the third counselor in the first presidency with President Kimball. And he mentioned that President Kimball believes that these problems are really not church problems, they're family problems, and they wanted to make them my problems. And one of the things he
Make it your
suggested
problem.
was he knew about my interest in the genealogy portion. I was already by this time collecting records, tracking down all the descendants of Joseph and Emma. So at that time, I'm the only one, including the church. Family Search didn't really exist so much at that time.
Not at
That
all.
had all the genealogy histories of all the descendants of the prophet Joseph. And he suggested that we organize a family organization. And his exact words to me is, quote, create opportunity for the posterity of Joseph and Emma to be receptive to the teachings of the gospel. And so that was my assignment that President Hinckley gave me. And I felt at that point that the first thing we needed to do was to help remove some of the prejudices. I had inherited items that had been passed down from one generation to the next within the family, and assumed that others had their own heirlooms and histories. And we would go about meeting with all the descendants, find their extended relatives through conversation with them, and document all of that. And that led us to discovering that 1/3 of Joseph Smith's posterity lived in Australia. There was a large group that lived in the Southern California area, a lot in Independence, and several on the eastern seaboard. And we
Another bunch
visited
in Montana.
in Montana, Gracia's family, and we visited with all of them, documenting them until we've got the database that today is about 95 to 97% accurate on all the descendants of Joseph and Emma. And so that's where things started with me. I didn't get part of that effort after we organized the family gathering is Buddy organized a reunion in Independence, and the Spirit told me that I needed to go to that reunion. And so I went there, and one of my experiences there is you had Sister Hale do a play on Emma. She did a one-woman performance. She asked me to give her a blessing prior to that because she's used to a Utah audience and she was a little bit nervous with the mixed audience in Nauvoo. So I went there early to give her this blessing. And then afterwards, I went into the audience. I was the only one there at the time because it was quite early, and she was setting up and preparing her props and getting ready. When a gentleman who was a Hiram descendant named Paul Hokinson came to visit with me. He was just retired from serving as a Seminary Institute director in Sydney, Australia. And he explained to me that there was a woman who was going to have heart surgery, and she wanted a blessing from the elders in her church. Well, the nurses assumed our church and called the mission president to fulfill that request. This woman happened to be a descendant of the prophet Joseph Smith and was referring to elders from her church, but the mission president did not have any missionaries available at the time that she requested that blessing. So he called the brother Hokinson, because he was over the institute that was there, and he got another one and went over and ministered to her, learning the relationship to the prophet's family. And after her recovery, she took him to visit with many of the descendants lived in Sydney, in South Wales, including Foster and Tuncurry, where the Smiths originally settled in that area and started their family. And he collected all their names and their addresses and handed them over to me at that reunion. And that's where I got the start to be able to prepare to go to Australia with Gracia's husband, Ivor, to collect all the descendants. And so Heavenly Father ended up putting many individuals in my path as we were going about the process of gathering Joseph Smith's family and documenting them and family history.
Paul Hokinson's wife is a descendant of Hiram.
Yes,
So that's
that's the
how
connection.
interconnected that is. And he is a fabulous genealogist as well.
Oh, that's really cool.
Boy, there are more things in heaven and earth involved with this family than it takes all
Yeah.
three of us, and we miss a lot.
One of the things I always mention in my firesides is I remember reading in the scriptures in Second Nephi, where Joseph Smith is mentioned as a seer that was going to be named after an ancient prophet, Joseph, who's also going to be named after his father. And I just sort of pictured in my mind as Joseph Smith is translating this or verbally recording this off so it can be written, that he had to have paused there and went and got his dad and said that God remembers him because he's mentioned here that's going to be part of Scripture. And in my mind, I was thinking, if this was known so far back in Scripture, then in the pre-existence, the cost of the restoration had to be known what it would be to the family. So what is the solution that Heavenly Father, what is the plan that Heavenly Father has in gathering his posterity from that cost? And Buddy and Gracia and I all became part of that overall plan to gather Joseph Smith's posterity to create opportunity they be receptive to the teachings of the gospel. So when I was baptized, I was the 18th descendant on the records of the church. I was the first to receive the Melchizedek priesthood. But today we have near 270 descendants that are now on the records of the church.
No. So, how quickly were you able, Buddy, to grab more of the descendants of Joseph and Lucy Mack and kind of dissolve some of the prejudices and bring them together?
Well, the Smith family sort of regenerates quickly. Not quite like rabbits, but there's a lot of Smiths. One of my young men that I enjoyed so much was Eric Larson, Dan Larson's son from the Joseph III line. He came up to me in Kirtland in, it was 87 when we had the reunion there. And he said, buddy, if I go back to Independence, Missouri after this Smith reunion here in Kirtland, I'm going to get into trouble. I I drive a forklift at a beer warehouse. So could I come to Orem, Utah, wherever that is, and live with you for a while? Because there's something spiritual about being here at this reunion. I don't want to lose it. If I go back and fall into my old habits and my old circle of friends, I'm afraid I'll lose it. I don't want to lose it. So he came to Orem. Before I realized how much he ate, I said, sure. Um, he had an appetite. And many of you know him. He's a big kid. He's 6'3" now and, about 240 pounds at least. And one of the rules, ground rules we had for the Smith reunion in those days is historical matters will be sponsored at the reunions and family genealogy, but theology is kind of off limits. They did it anyway. They talked about theology anyway, but officially it was off limits. So he asked if he could take the missionary lessons. Did we have missionaries? Oh, did we have missionaries? But suddenly they disappeared. When I told them I wanted them to teach Joseph Smith's descendant, they figured he'd already know everything. Well, he was a 19-year-old boy like they were. And they activated to go on the mission, and they were nervous about meeting one another. But he went through the lessons with them at my home. And when the lessons were over, he said, I've made a decision. I want to join the church. This is the first male descendant of Joseph Smith III to ever have the Melchizedek priesthood come into the church. He had that uniqueness. He said, I know you're a theater man, you're a promoter, but I'm also thinking I'd like to go on a mission. And I know how you are. You have a resume with you to read off about everybody when you take them into the church office. I don't want anybody to know I'm a Joseph Smith descendant. I just want to go on a mission after I'm in the church, wherever the Lord wants to send me. So promise you won't tell anyone. I didn't say a word, which for me is very difficult. But when he got his mission call, he opened it here in the living room. You want to guess where he was sent to?
I want to say Independence.
He was sent to Sharon, Vermont.
Oh, wow.
And about 3 months into his mission, he said, I'm so shy and I have a hard time talking to people. I had a real golden potential convert, and his family come here to Sharon this last couple of days. They were in a couple trailer homes. He asked all the right questions, and he just kept asking me more and more. And he said, I was so excited. And he said the next morning when I met with them to take them around the outskirts of Sharon, his wife came up to me and said, Uh, Young man, I thought you might like to know the man you've been talking to the last couple of days is Elder Paul Dunn, my husband. He used to be the mission president back in this area. And Eric had never heard of him, but Paul Dunn was long a favorite speaker of mine. I couldn't imagine anyone visiting with him that he would enjoy more than Paul Dunn.
Wow.
And Eric discovered also before that mission he'd have to learn to talk to people. Eric doesn't like to talk to people. He didn't understand what a mission had to do with talking to people. And I said, well, you go door to door. Door to door? So he was terrified. So I decided to make an audio visual tool out of him. I took him with to all my firesides the next few months and sat him up on the stand. And March was always my busiest month. I would do firesides for Relief Society birthday parties.
Same
And
here.
the sisters just loved him and would feed him. And he got his courage up by sitting through the meetings and answering questions and being a little bit of a celebrity. But he was always humble and shy. He never led with that. And at the 50-year reunion of the Smith family in 2022, I got to visit with Eric. Hadn't seen him in many years. It was really fun. We could get back and have that time together.
Wow, that's awesome.
I remember taking Gracia to the church office building. I said, if we just sit here by the elevator, you'll, in a day's time, meet all the general authorities of the church. They come right through here, the security desk, and then move on to their offices. So as we were sitting there, Gracia hadn't met too many of the general authorities at that time, had you, Gracia? Bruce McConkie came walking in. And I said, Elder McConkie, this young lady is a cousin of your wife's. She's a Smith descendant. And I remember him going over to Gracia and looking down at her saying, well, which branch of the Smith family are you related to? And she said, well, actually, I'm from the Joseph and Emma side of the family. He said, well, lots of people claim that. And he walked off. And it was kind of tense, but if you were around Elder McConkie, he spoke his mind, and lots of people claimed they were related to Joseph, seventh cousins or third or fourth. When I had Eric with me 10 years later as an audio-visual tool, and the ladies at the 18th Ward up on the avenues were fussing over him, Sister McConkie's widow came up to Eric and said, young man, I believe you and I are related. And he said, oh, lots of people claim that. What he meant was people were always coming up saying, well, I'm a third cousin of Joseph Smith 7 times removed, or something as equally difficult for him to grasp. And he really sincerely meant people are always claiming they're related. And I'm sure Elder McConkie was too. But I was a witness of hearing that story, sort of what going around comes around is like after hearing it the first time.
And
Yeah.
may I say this about Elder McConkie? He became a very warm and very kind friend once we got
Yeah.
acquainted. And he also, I said once to his daughter, was he very strict? And she said, he was a fun dad and always had jokes and always a fun thing to do. And I actually got to see that side of him a little bit once I got acquainted with that family. And he, nobody would believe this if you didn't actually swear to it. But he was the life of a party, and he was fun to know on a family basis, just as a friend and cousin.
That's great, Gracia.
That's awesome. Yeah, I
Well,
think I hear that a lot too. I'm related to Joseph this and this way, and it's usually far, far reaching. And I'm like, well, are we? That's kind of far out there.
you're pretty close. Gracia caused a great deal of consternation at the first reunion among the reorganized. I had so many come up to me. Now, how is she related?
Who is she?
How is she? They just couldn't believe that someone with her lineage from Alexander Smith had affiliated with the Utah church. And I remember telling the reorganized church patriarch that some of his people were having a hard time with Gracia, and he said, "Oh, they'll get used to it." We did. And when the reorganized patriarch came out to Utah for the reunion, I paired him up with Eldred G. Smith, our patriarch. And they had so much in common. They were both engineers. They had minds that worked similarly. And Eldred took Lynn Smith to Vernal, Utah, and they spent a whole day searching for fossils. And when I asked the reorganized patriarch what he had been doing that week, he says, "You'll never believe it. Two old fossils were out looking for fossils." And here's Joseph's descendant and Hiram's descendant, both patriarchs now in their respective churches. It was fun. It was fun to see them get together and see family similarities. They're there. Tempers, humor, everything.
And
Wow.
they became very good friends.
Pardon, Gracia?
They became very good friends. Lynn and Eldred became good friends.
Hmm. That's awesome. Gracia, is there anything that you want to add about the reunions that you feel is important to mention?
Well, one of the things that actually amazes me is that when we were trying at first to find names and different groups of the family, I wrote to the Temple Lot office and told them that we were going to do this family reunion, and could they help me find the family names that they would have. And they sent a whole list of the descendants and their addresses and phone numbers. Remember that, buddy? What a shock
Yes.
it was to
Oh, yes.
have that just handed to us. They didn't question our validity or our right to do it at all. They were excited to think it was going to happen. And we had some wonderful contacts through that process.
One of the senior missionaries, service missionaries that was interviewing me to get some of these stories into print, Steve Peterson. If I remember correctly, he's getting married on the 18th of this
16th,
month in
yes.
Nauvoo. They were going to go to Kirtland, but the temple ceremony for marriage isn't the same as they they don't have it as a ordinance. We still, and Steve met one of the Smith descendants, Mary.
Kim,
Is
Kimberly
it
Jones
Mary
Smith.
Jo?
Kimberly,
Kimberly Jones or
Kimberly Jo,
Kim Smith.
who's a descendant close to Gracia's side of the family. Her progenitor is the brother of Kimberly's. Um,
My grandmother and her grandfather are brother and sister, Alexander's children,
they're very close.
the two
But
youngest children.
Steve got interested in the Smith reunion from interviewing me, and then he wanted to go with to the Smith reunion, the 50-year reunion. And he attended that and the reunion in Salt Lake, and he and Kimberly were destined for each other. So, indirectly, gathering the stories, gathering the information, getting together for firesides, teaching. Gracious son David is doing so much there in St. George. I see you have seminars you're speaking at every other week. And Michael, I think you've exhausted the world. You've been here, you've been in Australia, you've been all over. And everywhere you go, there's some tie in, to someone else that you either know through the family or other means. And that's been fun to follow it through and see who's together.
The
Yeah.
reverse is true also because many times after the firesides, people come up to shake your hands and tell you how they appreciate the testimony that's being shared. And I have several that come on up and ask me if I know Buddy Younggreen or if uh, how I was related to Gracia. And so uh, it's been all of us.
It's been wonderful.
I would like to say Michael has done a greater work than anyone can ever imagine because of his skill with the computer. We have this database, and because of that, um, we can find any family member, and not everybody has access to that. It's very limited to us who will not use it for sales or for publicity or for wrongdoing. This database is carefully protected so that the family can trust that they're safe in it. And when he brought that about, it changed all of the tedious work of having to write everything out by hand or type it on a typewriter. Now you just turn on the computer and you put in a name into this program, and there it is. And when we first started, it was all by hand, it was all labor. Remember, Mike,
Yeah.
those great days? And when we first ever started to see this happen, we knew, and you were acquainted with Elder Bangeter back then, and he blessed, he talked about what the future would be, and it has unfolded exactly as they have expected, that this work has to have this modern convenience to happen. Couldn't have happened back in the old days, like when we were riding donkeys around the corner. You have to be able to keep in touch. And right now, through the process of the internet, we can sit down in our living room just like this and talk to each other right now. But we can have a conversation with the cousins in Australia, face to face, present time, and
Yeah.
we love them and they know it, and they love us. And this has been a wonderful, wonderful process of bringing the descendants, not just of Joseph and Emma, but of many, many of Father and Mother Smith's extended descendants, are they're able to visit together like this. It's a wonderful time we live.
Yeah, while you were talking about that, Dad, will you tell the experience that Aaron had as you were gathering all of the names and entering them into the computer?
Uh, we lived in a subdivision in southwest Provo called Harbor Park. Uh, and the home that we were in was had the basement as unfinished. So we converted that into an office, which I primarily used to document. And I spent many hours each day, well into the night until about 2 o'clock in the morning, doing daily entry from one branch of the family to another, collecting genealogies from Gracia originally started the records that were handed down to me in that packet that I received at the time of my conversion, and from families that we traveled to visit with, collecting all that information and entering it into the computer. And then I happened to mention to my wife that this record on this computer, which we shuffled with diskettes at the time, no hard drives when we began with. So one floppy 5.25 inch floppy drive to a next until we got to 3.5 inch floppies. And eventually hard drives were developed and I could put it on the hard drive. But I mentioned to Darcy that this is the only place where all the family history of Joseph Smith Jr. was contained. The church didn't have it. It was only here. And so we blessed the room and blessed the work that it be protected. I made copies of it and gave to Gracia and my mother to hold just in case something happened to the computer. And one evening, my son Aaron, my second born, wanted to sleep in that room instead of his bedroom. And so we didn't have a problem with that. At the time, I was working at the Provo Temple, and they were doing some remodeling, and so they were giving the veil curtains, and we used that as the walls around there rather than the concrete and the 2x4s, with the desk and the computer set up. And so we set up a little cot and whatnot for him to sleep on. The next morning, he came up to my wife and mentioned that he saw an angel down there while he was sleeping. My wife tested him and asked for a description. And so he described the angel and what he was wearing. And my wife asked if the angel noticed you, and he said, well, he didn't look at me, but he was looking from side to side like he was guarding something. And so it was sort of a testament to the protection that Heavenly Father wanted to those records until they were available enough that they were no longer going to be in great risk. So not only did it have genealogy information, it had biographies. I wanted to pay tribute, though, to the biggest contributor, above all, to the collection of that genealogy was Audentia Smith Anderson's book, the Ancestry and Posterity of Joseph Smith and Emma Hale Smith. She did quite a bit of the work, but that work was published in the early 1930s, and so it was dated at that point, but I had everything, and so I transposed that book, one character at a time, into the computer.
That's amazing.
You know, I have to tell you, Angeline, Gracia has been invaluable. She's been there from the beginning. She's visited more people than I could possibly even count. And Ivor has stood with her. They've traveled around the world. Michael and your mother have traveled around the world. They visited everybody. Our little nucleus is where we began. I've been thrilled with them from the beginning. Not only are they the progeny I was interested in seeking out, they really are my spiritual sister, and my spiritual brother, and I love all the family. I don't get into too many theological discussions with our Smith friends. Doesn't do any good. They're too into their own convictions anyway. But making friends, making memories. It was C.W. McCall, the Western lyricist, who put how I feel into the lyrics of a song. Life, after all, is simply a collection of memories. But memories, like starlight, go on forever.
Hmm. I like that.
Love you guys.
We
So I
love
asked
Your
you.
family.
a question from you guys. I am curious. Why do you think it's important for the Joseph Smith family to be gathered? The senior family, the junior family?
I think it says so in the 124th section. The seed of Joseph will bless the descendants of the earth like the seed of Abraham. It's a likening done there. There are blessings. Joseph's family, as Lucy Mack wrote about it in her application for a copyright on the book she did about her son.
Right.
This is the story of latter day Israel. Israel of old had had his name changed from Jacob to Israel, and the descendants of Jacob became ancient Israel. Today, the Smith family stands as modern day Israel, and the blessings to this dispensation that go with the restoration of all things that's associated with this dispensation of time comes through the Smith family, and we're all blessed for it. They gave so much to everyone, including me. I was happy to do anything to help gather that family together and still enjoy
Joseph
it.
Smith, Joseph Smith's patriarchal blessing promises him that his posterity will be in the Lord's book of life and in the patriarchal, let's see, yes, in the patriarchal blessing records. And that has come to pass and is coming to pass more and more. Uh, Many of the families still don't know who they are. It's interesting to visit with some of the extended family that don't have any desire to have anything to do with Mormon, but they're curious about this aspect of their relationships. And when we visit them, we're able to portray to them the love that we feel toward them. And sometimes it's a mystery to them. They simply can't hardly fathom how anybody could express this kind of feelings for them when we're so far apart. But it has to do with the bloodline. It has to do with the promises that God made to Joseph. And he made those promises, and he's keeping those promises. It's exciting to be part of it. We don't feel very adequate. We make mistakes. We bumble along just doing the best we can. And this Emma's Pearl program is one of the fruits of all of these things that we put together when Buddy started this family reunion business. He couldn't have had any idea the extent to which it would go. And here we are today
I believe
enjoying this wonderful feeling
yeah,
of
when
God's success, not ours.
just before Emma died, she tells a story she had where she had a vision where Joseph Smith came to her just before her death, and at the end of it, Emma exclaimed to her husband, "Where are the rest of my children?" And Joseph said, "Be patient, Emma, for soon you will have all of your children." And that's because of the blessings of the priesthood, the gathering that's been taking place with the reunions, and the ordinance work that is being done in behalf of that family, so that they are gathered on both sides of the veil. And so Emma does have her children. And
Yeah,
personally, I believe she's the one who is leading this effort.
I agree.
So, Gracia, the words of your uncle aren't exactly true when he said there isn't a place big enough. There certainly is now.
Well, it's the whole world. It- They're scattered all over the world, which also Joseph Sr.'s patriarchal blessing said that his posterity, like Joseph of old, his posterity would go over the wall. It's in almost every country. And fortunately, we're able to keep in touch with many of them through this modern means.
well, thank you so much, you guys, for joining us. And
Thank you, Angeline, for having me. Gracia and Michael, love you always.
Appreciate it.
for joining us on Emma's Pearls, and we'll see you next time.